global societal impact. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. I'm sorry to keep you later than you had planned to be. Thank you for joining for this installation of the Organizing for Good campaign, a collaboration between UNHCR and the organizational design community. I'm Özgecan Koçak, and I will be facilitating today's panel discussion about establishing public-private partnerships for global societal impact. The 17th goal in the Global Agenda for Sustainable Development recognizes the need to build global partnerships to mobilize and share knowledge, expertise, technology, and financial resources so that the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals can be supported in all countries. It asserts the need to encourage and promote effective public, private, and civil society partnerships to facilitate cooperation across the globe. On our panel today, we have Mamadou Diane Balde, Jerry George, and Ilse Kivlenietse to identify the challenges that arise when public and private organizations attempt to establish partnerships and to discuss what research on organizational design can teach us about building multi-stakeholder partnerships. We will first hear from Mamadou Diane, who will speak about why partnerships are needed for meeting global sustainability goals and what challenges arise in building partnerships. Mamadou Diane is Deputy Director of the Department of Resilience and Solutions at UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency. In this capacity, he oversees and supports UNHCR's global programs on education, economic inclusion and livelihoods, voluntary repatriation, and local integration. He has worked with UNHCR for over 20 years with field postings in Africa, Asia, and the headquarters in Switzerland. He has just moved from Switzerland to Ethiopia this past week. He has overseen the operational rollout of the comprehensive refugee response framework in several parts of the world. As I mentioned earlier, he has a PhD in law and has taught international human rights law. We will follow with presentations from Jerry George and Ilse Kivlenietse about how partnerships that are established for societal impact differ from those we see in the for-profit sphere and what we know from research about how best to design and run these partnerships. Jerry George is Professor of Management at McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, Senior Global Fellow at University of Pennsylvania's Joseph H. Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies, and visiting Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Singapore Management University. An award-winning researcher and teacher, he has published extensively in innovation, entrepreneurship, sustainability, and on tackling grand challenges in society. He just mentioned his book, the most recent handbook he is working on the business of sustainability. That's coming out in February next year. He also has a 2019 book on inclusive innovation and a 2018 book on managing natural resources. Jerry has done research on public-private partnerships in many contexts, and he will start by speaking about how they differ from for-profit partnerships. Ilse Kivlenietse is Assistant Professor of Strategy at INSEAD. Her research connects strategic management with broader issues related to the interaction between firms and public, political, and social environments. She has published in prominent journals of our field and has been awarded a Strategy Research Foundation Scholar Grant by the Strategic Management Society. Before joining academia, Ilse held senior account management and corporate development positions in advertising, telecommunications, and IT industries. She has done extensive research on hybrid forms of organization, and she will speak about these as well as cross-sectoral partnerships that bring public, private, and nonprofit parties together. Each panelist will talk about 15 minutes each. We will follow that with a discussion. As we listen to the panel, please type in any questions and comments you have in the chat so that we don't miss any relevant issues and can facilitate active audience participation during the discussion. Again, my apologies for starting us out late. And I hope this won't interfere in the way of our discussion after the talks. Mamadou Diane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Uzekan. I am very glad to join you here and to join this panel of experts. And I think we also take a bit of that burden you took and started late, so we all share it. Perhaps it will lessen it a bit for you. So I just wanted to start with that. Thanks again for inviting me. I will speak a bit about perhaps 2 or 3 issues. The first one to start with is the greater number of displaced persons, forcibly displaced persons. You all know that we now have close to 82 million people who have been displaced globally due to conflict and security, human rights violation, as well as additional involuntary and type of events that really lead people to leave their homes, to leave their livelihoods, to leave their educational institutions, to leave their families, or to be split from their families. So people keep being displaced, and the numbers, it just keeps growing without effective access to solutions. So that's really the context in which I work for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. These numbers were not as high as this 4-5 years ago. The context I really want to place the need for partnership to explain again the need for partnership between public institutions, government, UN agencies, as well as the private sector. 4-5 years ago in 2016, we were at around 68 million, 70 million displaced persons. And then really head of states, head of government decided that they should be organizing a meeting that happened to be in New York, where a New York declaration was adopted on refugees and migrants. That was on 19th September 2016. Why am I talking about that New York declaration and its comprehensive refugee response framework? It's because until 2015-16, refugees would come, they would mostly stay in the countries around their countries of origin. But in 2015, many more refugees left their usual areas of stay. Several Syrians went to Europe. Many more refugees left their immediate countries of asylum, and there were something we call onward movement. So that really led to a recognition of forced displacement as a global problem, and really required that governments meet, and they adopted the New York Declaration, which and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, calling really for 4 things. One, to say we need to help better refugee hosting countries, because refugees mostly stay in their regions of origin, and they do not stay in capitals. They stay in the most neglected part of these countries. It's some part of Pakistan, it's some part of Kenya, it's some part of Ethiopia, it's some part of Mexico. Refugees really stay in some of the places where you have the lowest level of development indicators. So the New York Declaration called for support for these countries. And they also said, let's help refugees live more dignified lives, so that as long as they remain refugees, they live dignified lives along the SDGs that Uzekan was talking about, so that people can have a better standard of living. And let's also work on solutions. These were the 3rd and 4th objectives of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. But to have that framework really implemented, we need not only need government. So government would agree on that framework, but they called on the contributions of the private sector. They called on the contribution of academia. They called on a contribution from research. And they also called from contributions not only from humanitarian actors, but also for development actors. They said that for us all to really tackle this global problem, we need to bring all our supports together, that we could not really do that. And for that, we needed to form in several countries, and I was privileged to be part of that global rollout. We rolled out the CRRF in 15 countries in Central Americas and Mexico, in the Eastern Horn of Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, as well as Afghanistan. So for that, in several places, we had to bring in together humanitarian and development actors. So people who would work on the short-term perspective when a problem arises, and others who would work on a longer-term perspectives, and who usually come with greater a number of resources. So that was really the first two issues I wanted to raise. How do they translate in reality? In reality, they have been translating into change of policies. You had countries like Ethiopia, very generous for centuries, that said, okay, let me change the laws of the country so that I will adopt a new refugee proclamation, and I will have refugees have freedom of movement. Refugees have access to work. Some of the SDGs were referring to. And for that to happen, we also needed to support not only refugees, but the host population. So for that, let's bring in the World Bank, let's bring in the private sector, let's have the International Chamber of Commerce also contribute to this, so that at country level, we can have this type of partnership really work for greater goods for the refugees and their immediate host populations. So this is how it has translated new policies, but also at country level, like here. This is what happened in Djibouti. It is what happened in places like Southern Africa. We were able to really have Zambia being further committed to making sure it works. And also in places like Mexico, we had internal relocation program from the southern border to the areas of Mexico that had some employment opportunities and partnering with the private sector. So this is how it has happened. Again, just to summarize a bit, you have a big problem. A large number of people are being displaced, and you've got a framework that is being created. And then for that framework to work, it is really public, private, and each one playing and leveraging its own role to really make it work. In the interest of time and to really allow us for possibilities to discuss, I will stop there. But I also did not want to only stop at the global level, but to say to you how it could translate into a country like where I sit now, into realities, into tangible services that can really help many more people, hopefully, if not achieve the SDGs, but go towards the SDGs, whether in terms of food, access to dignified life, access to water, access to work. Over to you.
Thank you, Mamadou, for this problem statement. Jerry?
Yeah. Mamadou had raised some exceptionally important problems, right? As we think of social and political unrest as leading to refugee crises, but we've also got ahead of us this huge climate change migration problem that's going to hit us like a wall over the coming decade or so, right? And so for us to think of from an organizational perspective, how do we fit within the broader conversation, right? From an academic discipline, multiple perspectives are there, right? You've got the development economic side, the political economy side, you've got the sociology side. But from an organizational perspective, we think of how can firms, especially when we think of firms, or organizations, we think of for-profit firms, but we also have to think about NGOs, and we've also got these sort of hybrid organizations that have mixed motives. So it's not quite immediately cut and dry of sort of saying that there is a specific format or an approach that works best, right? So to follow on from Mamadou's excellent framing of the problem, from an organizational perspective, I'm going to raise three issues, right? The first one is about value creation, and within each of these, you've got further divisions. The second point is about context and how that context or the phenomenon actually matters. And the third element I'll talk about is about form or organization, sort of what are the issues that it raises. So I'm going to talk about value creation, context, and form. So let me take the first one on value creation. Our emphasis when we talk about for-profit firms has been on economic value creation, right? And now we are shifting a lot of this discussion to what is social value creation. And that value creation is not just bound by economic terms with shareholder rights, but it's about broadening that conversation to social value creation, the communities in which we engage as firms, and so that there is this whole discussion on at what point does the boundaries of the for-profit firm end, or the responsibilities end, not necessarily the boundaries, but the responsibilities end. And when does a social problem become a firm problem, right? And when does a social opportunity counter to a problem, framing it in a positive way, when does a social opportunity becomes one that a for-profit firm could champion, right? So there is this whole discussion and a big issue on when and what is the responsibility of the firm, right? So let me give you one example. I used to live in Singapore till 3 months ago, and one of the large banks there approached me to ask this question, to sort of say, if we give funding to palm oil as an industry sector, is that the greater benefit or not, right? And the challenge in that value creation context is, yes, the bank does make money out of funding palm oil, but the social value is debatable in terms of when you talk about the biodiversity element versus the trade-off against poverty element, right? Because palm oil employs over 4 million individuals in the Southeast Asian region. So when you think about it from an employment versus a biodiversity issue, that line is not quite as clear in how firms can navigate that, right? So as we start thinking about this issue at a deeper level, we have to provide guidance on when these partnerships between firms like financial services firms or manufacturing firms working with the government in partnership, think of employment issues, but also have this trade-off against biodiversity or other climate change issues that might come up in the SDGs. So that this trade-off, some people would object to my use of the word trade-off, but this dilemma in how firms navigate this is an important one, right? The second issue, when we think from a management perspective within the value creation dialogue, is that we think of innovation as almost displacing, right? That we have a certain set of value creation that we had, and innovation sort of displaces that value and creates a new value creation model, right? When we put it in the social value creation problem, then you have to think about it in a different way. You can't say, I'm going to remove the value that was created earlier and create new value. So you're essentially then engaging in this value preservation paradox. How do I preserve the social value that was created, but at the same time create new elements of social value, right? The UK, for example, now is in these throes of discussions, as in many other countries, on how can you reform what they call universal credit or social care system. So by introducing a new system with private partners does not mean that we displace the previous system in a way that that social value does not matter. So how would private firms then engage in this conversation that preserves the old sort of model of social value creation, but then extend it in new ways, right? So that challenge of where do private firms fit and how do we create that social value becomes important. I'm working with a couple of my colleagues from SMU, Kenneth Go and Daniel Mack, and there we're looking at how an introduction of a new innovation, in this case, it's about fundraising from peer lending and all of these other micro fundraising models used by established social workers, right? So there's an existing paradox of how social workers raise funds for their initiatives, and then you've got a whole new model that sort of changes it. So the new model cannot displace the old way of how social workers do work, but at the same time have to accommodate how that extension happens. So this creates this paradox of value preservation. And the last piece in that, the value creation element, and Mamadou's point raises that very clearly, is that we think of economic and social value in very different ways than how Mamadou talked about value, right? In other words, he's in his mind, when he talks about value creation, he's thinking about social inclusion of opportunities for jobs, in resilience in terms of communities, right? If you'd like, I'd written an AMJ editorial in 2014, Managing Risk and Resilience, with Margareta Wallström, who used to run the UNHCR and UNISDR. She was an Assistant Secretary General or Special Advisor later on this. So you think of resilience and those type of social outcomes as outcomes of how firms can then contribute to. So we move away from just economic or opportunity creation metrics to a different set of metrics where firms can also think about, right, their contribution. And I think that is another way of extending the field, just in terms of value creation. Then the next element is context. In context, we have a few ways of thinking about it, and I've thought about it in three ways. One is the presence of institutions, or the weakness of institutions, the strength of institutions. When Mamadou talks about the government frameworks, policy frameworks, government support, all of those are the strength of institutions. But at the same time, refugee crises also operate in weak institutions, where the government frameworks don't exist or they do not cover enough. So how do we, as firms, then navigate within a policy umbrella with weak governance and weak institutions, right? And that's another setup. I've done a case study on India has this 108 system to call emergency services. But when that emergency services were first introduced, there was no, for example, Good Samaritan law, where people would come, if you are helping somebody who's injured and that person dies, then it becomes your problem. So nobody actually ever helped to stop and help a person on the road because they were afraid that they would then become liable for that person's injury, right? So in the absence of this context, how does this framework, then how do firms then navigate and build and create that? You can find all of these in my Google Scholar page, so you can look that up. The other one is social structure. So social structure means access to opportunities. Firms are huge players in access to opportunities. So this whole discussion in the US about access to opportunities, Black Lives Matter, and all of these are about how can individuals have free and clear access to opportunities. So context, social structure matters. And the third piece is, and I've done some work in Africa on rural electrification that fits within that. And the last one is on cultural context. Here it's about the cultures and norms of how things get done, right? And here are a lot of discussions on public-private partnerships, on how do you negotiate, how do you build for a longer period of time. And the last one on form or organizational form, I tend to think of it in three ways. In terms of in a public-private context, to think of how do I coordinate tasks and resources. And for coordination of tasks and resources, for example, one of the studies I've worked on some time ago with Ian Rorick and Caldwell is this in the NHS system in the UK, where you've got happens when a public-private partnership, but the model is for 30 years, where the private entity is typically a developer of property, essentially, physical estate. And that private firm has to think about how healthcare itself, the delivery of healthcare is likely to change over a 30-year period. So how then do you coordinate these tasks if the task itself is not clear and that ambiguity changes over time, right? Then there's issues of thinking about relational coordination and how you manage that. On information, again, you've got, for example, could be in the refugee crisis or in healthcare, you've got a government that provides some information and you've got local agencies that provide some information. But these information elements are not really coordinated. So we noticed that, for example, in the beginning of the pandemic, when the government was reporting some numbers and local hospitals were reporting other numbers, and that information is not consistent. And so when private firms then engage in this conversation, how do they then navigate information asymmetry, information problems associated with governance, and so on? And the last one is about incentives. Public-private is about some ways in which you think of, I'm forming a partnership over an extended period of time, but the private incentives are like, I still need to pay for my shareholders. So how do you reconcile this idea of incentives in a short versus longer run, right? So I'll give you this example of roads in India, right? A lot of the roads, physical transport, and it works in transport infrastructure just as well, is that many of the roads have a predicted model for a 30-year life cycle. And then you build those roads with the idea that traffic will increase over time and you can pick toll over time. Now, sometimes what happens is that that prediction is not necessarily pan out the same way that you think it's going to pan out. So some projects become unviable. So there the government has to step in to subsidize the fund. But in some profits, it goes the opposite way. It becomes viable right at the beginning. So the economic incentives are clear. So from a private perspective, this question is, what are my incentives for building public infrastructure? And when am I going to get paid and how am I going to get paid? From a policy perspective, it becomes, how can I deliver a social infrastructure where I get the benefits of it in my next election cycle, perhaps, thinking if I were to not trivialize it, but to talk about the reality of how you think of governments working, you think of social infrastructure providing the next election cycle, but at the same time, for a for-profit firm, they have a 30-year model. So how do you make these trade-offs and these incentives? So let me stop there and say that there are a huge number of questions that come from Mamadou's point about how do we think of value creation? what is the context in which public and private interface happens? And from an organizational perspective, how do we think of tasks, information, and incentives in that as solutions? Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. This is a great framework to think about the enormous variability we're going to see in partnerships across the globe and across different issues. Thank you. Ilse?
Yes, thank you very much, Ozcan and Panish, for having me here. I'm also very, very pleased to be here with Jerry and Anita, who have been two and still are two amazing mentors to myself. So, and very nice to be following this on Jerry, especially because I hope that my presentation will be able to build on some of the points. Now, my speech, just to organize it a bit, I've actually prepared a number of slides that I'm going to share. They also based on a couple of talking points that I will show you briefly. Let me just share it and you tell me if that works. Okay, so are you able to see my slides now?
Not yet.
Okay, let's wait. Oh, we unfortunately didn't have time to test this, but hopefully, okay. It seems to be bugging. So I have a share on my side. Does it work on your side?
No, we see a black screen. We can see that you have started screen sharing. Maybe the right window is not picked.
Yeah, let me try to fix that and reshare again. Okay. Sharing and reshare again. In the worst case, you will just have to take
you
my
could email it to me as well.
Okay. Let's see. Does this work better?
Yes.
Okay. Do you see my slides now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, great.
Thank
so,
you.
Building on Jerry's and Anadou's excellent papers, I'm going to give something that is also very much an academic perspective of on this important topic of how you can establish and specifically organize, because this is an organizational design community panel for global societal impact, and really talking here about notions of social value and sustainability very much in the same spirit as Jerry and Manadu has mentioned. Now I'm going to skip the intro on myself as is nicely, very kindly presented by Ozcan. Let me just say that my special attention and research work has been on public-private partnerships and different types of hybrid organizations in largely infrastructure sectors. So I've principally studied water and sanitation sectors, especially in the emerging country context. I've also looked into public-private partnerships in other areas of infrastructure. One of the most exciting projects that I'm working currently is a longitudinal study of largest transportation contract in UK, public-private partnership that involves the M25 highway, a 30-year, £5 billion contract, and what are the organizational collaboration implications as this partnership evolves. And then recently, I've also looked in the new novel hybrid models of delivering healthcare services, again, in what we could call particularly resource-constrained settings. So I'm trying to refer to a couple of these examples in my presentation. So I just wanted to give you a preview of, I'm going to be making 4 main points here in my talk. And those will center on the first question that might seem obvious, but that is worth revisiting, which is, why do we see rising partnerships, and also why do we see such specific interest in partnerships as vehicle for addressing a lot of society's pressing issues. And my proposition here would be revisiting and looking back at the rationale or partnership emergence is very much based in the dual failures that we've experienced and in many ways continue experiencing in the market and public bureaucracy's perspective. The second point I want to make is that when we talk about partnerships, we really talk about a very broad phenomenon, and there is almost a need to open up that partnership black box. And for that, we might need to think particularly from organizational design perspective of what would be the right or perhaps new theoretical lens. And here again, I wanted to make a point about the notion of hybridity as a particularly interesting concept that many scholars adopt, though there seem to be two quite distinct notions to that. And let me just comment on them as well. And I think it might be very helpful to move the research and our understanding of partnerships forward. I wanted to briefly address the fundamental question that Anish raised when he advertised this panel, which is, what's different about these partnerships, and that inevitably demands understanding what is the state of research, what do we know about interorganizational collaboration, and what is different when we consider that interorganizational collaboration in the context of social value and public needs. And of course, that leads to some interesting areas for further research. Now, for the sake of time, I might go briefly over that, but I think we'll also hopefully have a nice discussion afterwards on these points. So interesting point about rationale behind cross-sector, and in this case, that would be public-private, but also civic sector, NGO, partnerships is that the rationale behind it often seems evident, but revisiting it is important. And I think one of my most interesting insights on this is whenever I raise this question and discuss it here at INSEAD, where I have a chance to teach in social entrepreneurship program. So one of the interesting debates we always have at the beginning of my session with the social entrepreneurs that come is, I try to push them and ask them, so if we take a kind of academic, a bit, let's say, controversial view, what is it in the current dominant organizational forms like private firms or governments that we need actually this partnership, that they cannot address it, right? And of course, they are very quick to come up and answer those questions, right? So if I ask them, why cannot private firms solve the society of challenges? It's very quick to get a list of key concerns, right? Different objective functions, too large, complex, systemic problems and social needs that cannot be addressed, many markets that are non-monetizable, how to achieve social inclusion equality, particular relation to different objectives, and even very much a question of legitimacy for underlying action. I think that one of the interesting concepts that has perhaps not received sufficient attention is the notion that in some contexts and in some sectors, private firms may have inherent liability being private, an inherent lack of legitimacy. It's a term that comes from Banchi and Oxley's 2013 paper that's very interesting, deals specifically with partnerships, and they show how the liability of this privateness itself might be a substantial obstacle to private sector engagement, right? And then, of course, we turn to the other side and asking them, so why can a public sector address these challenges? Why do we need the partnerships? The list is even longer, and we see the lack of efficiency, lack of innovation. Economists would probably argue that both stem from lack of ownership and limited competition. But we also see more complex issues, such as double agency problem. Politicians themselves are weak agents or sub-principles, so to say, of broader constituent interests. We see fundamental incentive problems that I think Jerry referred to. Too many sectors are affected by the vested interests or the electoral cycle focus of governments. One of the most interesting papers that has come out recently in water sector is by Carlos Inouye, who studied Brazil's water sector and found how essentially election cycles affect the state-owned firm performance and how very much election years mean both higher employment and lower firm performance. So these kind of effects are very valid and largely explain the continuous failure maybe of public sectors really address these issues. Now, what is interesting then is in some way we can bring together these two aspects and say, well, paradoxically, the rise of these partnerships and social ventures and other hybrid organizations is in fact a fruit of two failures: the failure of market, ability of private actors to effectively allocate resources to address societal needs, but also very much a failure of state, or state in the meaning of public bureaucracy, to engage in that kind of resource allocation in an effective and fair way. And now, of course, the key question is, can you create a success out of two failures? And I think that is a fundamentally deep question, because in too many instances, people have thought that simply combining both organizational forms, you might be able to inherently overcome these two types of weaknesses. And that has not been necessarily the case. And for instance, my research in water sector has been very humbling, because there's literally decades of research that, of partnerships that have failed, and that have largely failed because they have not been able to overcome the inherent weaknesses or risks in each of these different organizational forms. And so this leads me to the first question. What is interesting for us, I think, is as management and organizational design scholars, is what kind of organizational design principles and mechanisms may help to overcome the weaknesses if we recognize that there are these inherent weaknesses in the two sectors. Now, the second point I wanted to make is there's also promise in understanding them and need, in fact, in understanding what do we mean when we talk about partnerships. And this is why I call it the black box of partnerships, because in fact, we see a wide range of organizational arrangements that go from, purely philanthropic collaboration. You can have a firm, a pharmaceutical company donating to UNICEF or to other UN organizations, but you can have an increasingly see a more commercial ties-based model. So here's the picture of a Burmese bank, but there are also other models. One of them, most interesting research project that I'm doing currently, we're actually exploring a social franchise, an organizational form that's not very common. And that's a social franchise that is providing primary healthcare services in South Africa, specifically trying to address the need to overcome highly expensive, very weak public sector provision, at the same time limited and expensive private sector provision. And there's this organization that has a non-profit head organization franchise provider who selects, trains, and enables local nurses to become social entrepreneurs and lead profitable businesses. And from organizational design perspective, what is fascinating in this story is how they combine the elements of, so to say, for-profit franchise model, commercial incentives, layering them with the top-level non-commercial incentives, and kind of trying to find this hybrid model that works, and in addition is scalable and scalable in quite an efficient way. So I'm happy to share, if you're interested, more information on that. What I'm trying to say here, though, is that we need to try to open even more this black box of partnerships and try to explore the models that lie in both ends of this spectrum, but also within this gray zone. And of course, in order to do that as academics, we also need certain theoretical tools and lens to look at it. And this is where I want to go back to the point of hybridity, which I think also Jerry raised. So how to think of these partnerships and how to conceptualize about them. And thinking of this question, in 2017 with my colleagues Bertrand Kellan and Sergio Lazzarini, we actually tried to come up with a framework that addressed this question: what are hybrid organizations, and how we can think of this term and use it in a fruitful way. And the key insight here really is that when we talk about hybridity, there are really two dimensions we talk about. One is hybridity, what scholars often call in logics, which essentially is hybridity motives, as Jerry already mentioned, right? So do we as an organization pursue one set of objectives, largely commercial, or do we try to have these mixed motives? And but yet there's another dimension in governance, right? And that comes closer to organizational design perspective. So to which extent are we relying here on unique single bureaucracy type of organization and a common established set of design principles, or are we maybe mixing different governance elements, different set of incentives, different ownership patterns, and in this case creating some form of hybrid governance? And we think, as we argue in this paper, and I'm convinced that it is quite helpful to actually unpack and understand hybridity in both of these dimensions. Might be a very fruitful way for those of you who are interested in this topic to look and think. I'm hoping that it's helpful. My almost last point is going back to Fanish's point. So if we understand why we see the rise of partnerships and what they represent or how to think about it, the key question, of course, is what's fundamentally different? And particularly, what is fundamentally different here from what we know already about inter-organizational collaboration? So kind of so what question. And here I think I very much would echo the points raised by Jerry as well as Mamadou. I think there are at least three dimensions that are important in understanding how cross-sector partnerships for social needs and social impact are different or add another set of or layer of complexity to traditional, let's say, private sector collaborations. And first of all, that's objective function. So Jerry's point about the need to create a social value, which extends the private benefits is a crucial distinction. Second is the temporal horizon. So it's very rare to come in a private sector and find a fixed contract that's signed for 30 years with a clear understanding of what kind of value that needs to be delivered in 30-year perspective. And in many of the sectors, in healthcare, in infrastructure, you see the temporal horizons, which are large, and of course that bring in this problem of increased uncertainty and how to deal with that. And the third distinction that I think increasingly comes from existing research is that often, of course, these partnerships engage in much broader and much more diverse stakeholder spectrum. And that in itself creates an additional challenge, but I think also opportunity for scholars who are studying these partnerships, because how to manage those very diverse stakeholder interests, the multiplicity of the stakeholder interests itself is a very interesting theoretical question that has important practical implications. So if there are differences, what are the key tensions and challenges? And this is a very dense slide, but this will be almost my last one. Jerry, I think, mentioned that he and Anita are having a handbook on business sustainability that's forthcoming. And myself and my colleague, my co-author Jens Rohrig, had an opportunity to contribute to it with a chapter on partnerships, particularly public-private partnerships as vehicles for social value creation and distribution. And I wanted to leave you with a couple of thoughts that we had from that chapter, because I think they help to highlight at least three sets of tensions that are really important, that can be worthwhile to understand and to pursue in future research for any scholar who wants to more deeply understand the public-private partnerships or cross-sector partnerships more broadly. And I think the key insight that we gained there is from the excellent paper by Ranjay Gulati in Academy of Management Annals 2012, where he argues that any interorganizational collaboration has at least two facets, and one is more known, I would say, studied than the other. And one facet is how to achieve cooperation in a sense of aligning the actors' interests. And this is very much the focus of classical governance literature, right? So how do we create governance mechanisms that align those interests and permit the collaboration? Less studied facet is though, how do you achieve coordination, which is about how do you synchronize actors, tasks, activities, and resources? And I think that their fundamental insight is very relevant also for cross-sector partnerships or public-private partnerships, because these same fundamental tasks, or let's say challenges, remain there. And there's some really exciting, there's some really exciting work that has emerged over the past decade that I think helps to address these two tensions. So I've just put, for those of you, especially PhD students, here a couple of references. So they're excellent papers by Anita and her co-authors on how achieving the right governance solution is essential in actually being able for these organizations to address underlying social issues. There are papers that also demonstrate how misfit in underlying governance, for instance, public-private governance, might have detrimental effects on the social value that's created and overall value that's created, or for instance, on innovation. Myself and other scholars have also increasingly turned to understanding the role of capabilities that are different and reside in each sector, and how the lack or the presence of such capabilities affects the partnerships. And I think that is a very fruitful area for research as well. Now, turning to the second point, which is how do we achieve coordination, there's very interesting work that starts to emerge on understanding different coordination paths or trajectories, for instance, in interorganizational projects in infrastructure. My colleague Fanish and co-authors have written an excellent paper, which from theoretical perspective defines meta-organizations. And I think in some way, maybe Fanish would not agree, but I think in some way you could think about many of these partnerships as meta-organizations. This is bringing independent actors together and working for the same goal in a coordinated way. And the last point I wanted to make, and this is a point we try to put forward with Jens in this chapter, is besides these two C's, we might want to add a third C when we talk about cross-sector partnerships. And we call this C achieving cooptation. And that really goes back to my previous point is, if we recognize that what's really particularly unique or more complex about partnerships in social sphere is this notion of the breadth and diversity of stakeholders. And that might mean that these forms of collaboration, even more than purely private ones, need to address and engage with this broad stakeholder community. And at least two important questions then arise. How do actors manage the stakeholders within these collaborations? How do they cope with them? How do they overcome the risk of adverse reaction? Water sector partnerships have been literally plagued with social activists that have fought against these forms of collaboration, right? So this is very important question. There's research that has shown the same effects in other industries, for instance, resource extraction industries. And the related question, a very promising one, is of course, in order to achieve a cooptation, can we study more the organizations that have embedded in them the community design principles? And here I'm thinking of fundamental work of Ostrom. And I think there's a lot of potential and exciting work that's around those organizational design principles, and I think would very much be in line with the spirit of these three key tensions. So I think I might be a bit over time. So let me finish here by saying that these all represent exciting areas for further research, and I'd be very happy to take on further points during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilse, for this extensive overview of the many different governance forms and the variability in capabilities that organizations have, both within and across the different governance forms. I see we're already starting to see hands up for questions from the audience. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'll just jump in right away and ask those of you who have hands up to pose your questions verbally. If you click on the reactions button right underneath your Zoom screen, you're going to see the function to raise hand. If you use that, then it's going to be most easy to order the questions. Anita.
Thank you so much, everyone. I am completely compelled and supportive of this amazing, brilliant comments that are made by all three speakers. Thank you. I wanted to ask about the problems that Mamadou raised at the beginning and whether or not they could be different in kind from anything that we've ever considered before in terms of organizational response. In other words, I'm very much aligned with the kind of comparative organizational issues and the structural issues that Ilse has described, and the broad agenda on value creation, context, et cetera, that Jerry described. What I'm wondering is if some of the issues that constitute grand challenges on the frontier, not all, but some, especially around refugees and climate, could be beyond the boundary of what any organization has currently been able to address. I guess this is mostly for Ilse and Jerry.
Let me give that a shot, Anita. In some ways, yes and no, right? Yes, that it is different as a problem because of the sort of the cultural and social issues associated with it, and this idea of how do firms engage within that context. But no, in the sense, if you look at the organizations actually helping deliver these refugee resettlements, there are papers on Paul Tracy's worked on in how do for-profit firms create opportunities in terms of employment and engage with resettlement of some of these individuals. So in a sense that the phenomenon is more complex. So we might want to think of our metrics rather than economic or social value creation in much more different ways of what are the outcomes of resilience, resettlement, opportunities, employment, cultural integration, all of these things. But from an organizational perspective, you would think of how do I actually engage with that problem in terms of the scale and scope of these efforts, as well as what are the sort of coordination failures that are likely to happen in this context, and the institutional elements within that. Those parallels, I think, exist in different problems as well, right? If you look at, so for example, even if you think of oceans, plastic in oceans or so forth, it's kind of a big scale problem. It's a commons problem. And how do firms engage with these commons type problems? There are some similarities within that. But I agree that there are nuances of the refugee crisis. It's about humans in distress and firms constrained within their own sort of stakeholder issues that then have to engage in this humanitarian crisis. I agree that there is something about the problem itself that could be different.
I just wanted to add on this, and I think, Anita, this would also ring a bell to you because we have spoken about it. I think that the systemic aspect of these challenges also makes our focus on fixed organizational solutions a bit obsolete, in a sense that we might want to consider and see our research even more as problem-centric than the form-centric. And we even see that, I mean, I see that looking at these large meta project organizations, you know, they just change the organizational form. They just reassemble assets, resources, and they just kind of reconfigure, and they emerge as something completely different. And that that flexibility, fluidity, and in a way, ironically for us strategy scholars, the non-fixed nature of organizational solutions is also, I think, very interesting and poses a challenge, I think, for us as a field as well.
I might follow up. Sorry.
Yeah, no, if I may, a bit on that one, that I think Anita raised a very important question. And if I may, perhaps just reflecting on it from three perspectives, a historical perspective, but also a current one. You know, the refugee issue has always been a big problem. In 1920, the first High Commissioner for Refugees was created because you had revolutions in Europe, Russians 1917 being chased from Russia coming into Europe. And Fridtjof Nansen was created by the League of Nations, asked to really help with documents that would help people move freely within Europe and have access to employment, have access to solutions, but also to be resettled in these countries. So that was, for a few years, it was a problem solved through the creation of the first High Commissioner for Refugees. And then at some point, the League of Nations became irrelevant because it was no longer that necessary. But between the Russian refugees and 1945, you really had a number of waves of refugees. For each one of them, there was an organization created for that. When the High Commissioner for Refugees was created in 1950, it wasn't because of a failure of bureaucracies or that public private partnership type of work. It was because of the need to really have an intergovernmental entity able to work with government to have the regulatory framework. So the Right Convention stating what a refugee as a foreigner can have as right to live dignified life until he or she is able to return or find solutions. So when the High Commissioner for Refugees was created in 1950, it was in fact given just a 3 years lifetime. It was only to solve problems in Europe. And then it got extended over the years for 5 years until 2004, when a former High Commissioner decided that, you know, this is just not a recognition of the magnitude of the problem. So I think Anita is right that for certain problem, it's not only one entity, and this is what the New York Declaration told us. You need to work with government, you need to work with private sector, you need to work with the refugees themselves, concerned persons, so that that type of partnership with cities and others to really increase your chances to find a solution to the problem. So the partnership is really a necessity. And that was really what we had several decades ago. That was really from a historical perspectives. What I wanted to add to that is that whenever you get those problems, they are not necessarily solved at Geneva level or New York level. They are sometimes solved in Ankara, they are solved in Addis Ababa, they are solved in Mexico City. So it's not at that level. And even when you come to the issues around Mexico, the issues are not solved in Mexico City, but at the border places and with the private sector. This is what happened. And this is how you see that a local mayor is in fact the right answer to most of these problems. With the right resources, with the inclusion, with the acceptability by the communities hosting them, which is usually the most generous one. So I wanted to say that responding to a refugee situation, as big as it is, as can be localized, and then you can find a solution. So the partnership is also then an issue of necessity. And the third angle is really the tools and the institutions, and to making sure that the organizations that are being created or are able to adapt. For example, as an international civil servant, I work for the UN. How can we make sure that our procurement, for example, rules and are able to help me, deliver the services that I can do for the betterment of the people. So these were just three perspectives, again, to call for a genuine partnership between various actors and the research, the academic community. For a long period of time, we could not, for example, advocate effectively for refugees to be received in countries, because people believe that when refugees are received, it's a burden on a country. This has been a mantra in several places. A few years ago, we were able to partner with some economists. I'm a lawyer, but we partnered with economists, we partnered with the World Bank and others, just to see what are the benefits that receiving refugees can bring to a host community, so that it can leverage and help our advocacy with bread and butter type of things, with data. So we've been using them. So the academic community also helped quite a lot. So partnership to solving issues like refugee matters is a necessity, and you definitely need them if you want to increase your chances to finding solutions to these great needs. Over to you.
Thank you, all the panelists, for addressing Anita's question in some depth. I wanted to open this up a little bit more, perhaps, and get a bit more detail from you on this problem of how do we articulate what is the value that needs to be created, either when we are facing a crisis like the refugee crisis that is very immediate and visible and clearly has high urgency, high magnitude at a cross-national level, or a crisis like the climate crisis, which is dawning on us gradually and is taking a while to figure out what the enormity of the problem is, what implications it has for various parties, and what might various solutions be. So one issue that seems to be to go beyond the for-profit sector's capabilities, as Anita put it, is articulating first what is the value that needs to be created most immediately. How do we prioritize the problems that need to be solved? How do we allocate resources? And whether these decisions are made politically or in the public sector, or more broadly in a more decentralized fashion. In the chat, I see Bernard Moore has asked a similar question. His first question about whether there's any research focusing on the impact of who initiates the partnership. Example, initiated by not for profit or for profit. So, and he has given the example of the Equitable Food Initiative in California, which was initiated by a union representing field workers. So we can imagine in different contexts and in different times, the governments, either national or local, taking the lead in deciding where we most immediately need value creation, of what type of value creation, and who needs to do that. Or we can see a more bottom-up mobilization of all kinds of forms of organizations taking up whatever piece of the problem they can handle themselves. So I'm wondering whether you could speak to this variation. Perhaps Mamadou has seen different countries respond differently to similar challenges, and we've all experienced this with the pandemic. For instance, in the US, the federal government, the federally divided government and the states and local governments have taken different approaches. And whereas in most other countries, there's been a more centralized approach to dealing with the pandemic. And so the pandemic is one problem. Other kinds of social value creation issues like education, they sometimes might benefit more from a decentralized approach. So I'm wondering what kinds of variation you see there and how you think about public-private partnership from at this very first stage of deciding, what value do we create first and who needs to be the parties interfering first. Mamadou, do you want to go first?
George, and then Jerry, and then I continue, if it's okay.
Okay, sorry, George, I didn't realize you had unmuted yourself.
So one of the, when we think of value creation and who initiates these partnerships, I think it's an important problem, right? In terms of, because it sets the context or the basis for the dialogue and for the conversation around it. There are some papers in, for example, the wind turbine industry, certification for organic certification, and sort of who initiates these discussions then becomes, there are some papers, Anne Terlack in ASQ, Andy King, all of these folks think about certification sort of models of who starts first and the bandwagon effect that goes after that and so on, right? So yes, it matters on who starts the dialogue, right? But it also matters on, as Mamadou had talked about earlier, sort of who lays the umbrella policy within which we all engage, right? And there's a paper on sort of melting summits. It's a 2014 AMJ paper on climate change dialogue in how different actors engage with the problem based on how the problem itself is framed and the discussions that go within that, right? So from that question that Bernard asked, I think the important issue is what is the sort of institutional framework that is set up based on who frames the problem, right? And from that, because most organizations are solutions providers in engaging with the problem, and who frames the problem actually makes a big difference, right? Mamadou, yours, please.
No, thank you, Jerry. I think I couldn't agree more. I think I have seen in my field of work, those who initiate such type of partnership might be local leaders. It can be local communities who are usually the first responders. Local communities are the first responders when refugees arrive. And then, they table the issue. Refugees have arrived. We shared whatever we have. And if it continues like this, we will need shelter, we'll need access to healthcare. They are starting to overburden our education institutions, or we no longer have enough teachers, etc. So it can come from the host communities itself. It could also come from the government. It could come from a mayor. And you might have heard me a bit speak quite a lot about mayors. I think these are, unlike central government, they are people who usually deal with the real issues. I've got a problem in relation to access to water, access to education. How do I solve it? And when it happens that refugees are hosted far away from capitals, they are the most innovative. They are the one who really frame the problem and ask for a solution, very often with a solution orientation. So it's all very often like that. International organization could come with their own framework, with lessons learned from other parts of the world, and very often, not always, but very often we share and try to adapt it, and then I think then we have greater chances of success. When we do think of transposing things, then that's a good recipe for failure. But I think when we try to adapt it to a specific context, recognizing that even two countries that are bordering each other, Ethiopia and Djibouti, can be very different in terms of population, 110 millions versus a few millions. How do you make sure that that you adapt the solutions to the context? So the initiator can be very important, but I think the framing is equally important, but also the need for support. We were speaking about the SDGs, and SDG 4 is about education. And that's really, let me just move away from a country level to a global level. So SDG 4 is about quality education as a goal, one of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have refugees struggling to access primary education, pre-primary, tertiary, very low level as compared to nationals in their own countries, but also secondary. And secondary is the time when you've got people really getting ready for adulthood. And this is the time when girls are very often disproportionately affected in several parts of the world. But about, in order to reach the goals of SDG 4, you have got few institutions, and one of them is the Global Partnership for Education based in DC, and some of you might know it. It's one of those partnerships that exist for quite some time now, not but that is really bringing in government. And I sit on the board of the GPE, on the Global Partnership on Education. In it, you have got partner country represented, so government of around 50 or over countries, mostly recipient of support, represented there. You've got donor country representative and representing constituency on the partnership on the board. You've got teachers, representative of teachers on the board. You've got a representative of the business community on the board. And then people like me who represent multilateral organizations and development banks on the board. That's a recognition that to achieve really SDG 4 or some dimensions of SDG 4, you do not only need government, you also need the private sector, you need people who are directly affected, you need the government, and then you need the institution. This, I think, is, in its name itself, is the Global Partnership for Education. That's something. And having being on the board of that GPE, I know how important partnership is to solve big issues and some of these big problems. Oh.
Thank you, Mamadou Diane. I see some questions in the chat asking for a clarification of terms about public, private, and this can easily be confused in the US when we say public firms. We are actually talking about for-profit, privately owned by publicly traded companies. And so can I ask the panel for a clarification of terms before we proceed with more questions?
I'm happy to take this one. I think this is indeed a tricky terminology, because myself, as I've worked on public-private partnerships, people have come to this question. So what has helped me, and I think I put it also in a note, is to think of these collaborations as collaborations between three fundamentally different sectors. Public, as in the meaning of state being up to the lowest level of municipality, public bureaucracies, sort of in traditional governance sense. Another sector being private institutions, and those could be public in the sense of listed, they can be privately held, those can be family firms. And then the third sector being the civic society, that's often organizing in the form of NGOs, but can also be organized in the form of social movements and other forms. I think it's helpful. And a number of papers that also define these as cross-sector partnerships. So maybe that's a helpful way to look at that. In my research, I've also referred to them as tripartite partnerships. You could even imagine drawing a triangle and saying, there are some partnerships that are purely between private firms and governments. There are some which are between private firms and NGOs, and then there are some that maybe involve all these three sectors. So I don't know if that is helpful. I just wanted to make a small comment, very, very brief, on the previous question you raised, Osgecha, regarding who initiates. I think there's one element that is very important in these partnerships, and that refers to this question, who initiates. Very often, the question of who initiates is a function of capabilities. And what I've seen in the past research is that, and what we know from existing studies on interorganizational cooperation is that partnering is an organizational capability that can and should be developed. Okay? So our 20, 30 years of research and alliances has shown that organizations that learn and codify and build on their knowledge of how to run alliances succeed better. And this is a lesson that is transferable also to these other sectors. And often we see that there's potentially lack of partnering precisely because the sector, such as, for instance, public organization initiative, lacks the knowledge. It might be lack of knowledge in contracting, partner selection. And one of the research papers that myself and our colleagues have published a few years ago on organizational science, we've actually looked at the public-private partnerships across the world and realized that those countries where you have an institutional country level, some form of knowledge transfer or partnership, PPP competence centers, that plays a big role in understanding when these partnerships are likely to emerge. And I also suspect how long they will last or how successful they are in achieving objectives. So I think that this question of organizational capabilities can be very interesting as well in this context.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat from Julia Flower about how do we determine what good success looks like at a sector, state, and country level? What metrics should we be considering at sector, country, and community level? I think this speaks partly to, Ilse, what you had introduced earlier about setting up an objective function, and also what Jerry had mentioned earlier about what is the responsibility of the firm, right? And to tie it to the thread of conversation we were already having, so what is the firm's responsibility to initiate an action, as in the palm oil funding example? Like, what should the firm's responsibility be in recognizing problems and interfering in them, and how should we be holding them accountable at all for various performance metrics on these social impact issues?
I'm not sure. I think the best person would be Ilse in taking up the metric issue, but I don't think there is a singular metric within each of these, right? So for example, if you look at the World Business Council Sustainable Development, they've taken the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and then broken it up into multiple metrics to see whether there is target. One possibility for you to think about metrics is to say, if you want to tie it to the SDGs, then you then break it up into what the WBCSD, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, then breaks this up into metrics for how for-profit firms can engage in this, right? So that could be one set of metrics. But I don't think there is a comparability, like firm performance, you can say, is some kind of profitability measure or some kind of stock market measure. I don't think you've got an equivalent social measure that works across community, country, as well as at the individual level, right? So you then have to think about from a firm perspective, what would be appropriate success metrics, right? One possible suggestion of gleaning these success metrics is sort of self-imposed in a way that how do firms frame and present their impact in their sustainability reports could be one way of thinking about how firms define success for themselves, right? So you could then create sort of these are big data ways of thinking about it. And can you look at natural language processing in sustainability reports to then define relative success of and self-reported relative success, and then use that as a metric? These are just suggestions. Right? Thanks.
I wanted to add on this that I think this is a very complex question, and there's a lot of work being done now to develop and devise very detailed metrics. I think taking it just one level, maybe before the actual metrics, what I found interesting looking at partnerships and thinking about how to conceptualize about the value is those cases where the firms or the partnering organizations, instead of defining metrics, think first of the stakeholders that are going to be impacted by this, and in some way you can define that the investors is just one type of stakeholder, and looking at the sort of the benefits, the net benefits or the impact that flows to different groups of stakeholders might be a helpful way. And I have seen it in a number of partnership contexts where specifically different groups in local communities, particularly disenfranchised groups, are being up. So you have a lot of public partnership contracts now that are being signed where part of the value that has to be delivered, for instance, is reducing local unemployment. So you would take up people from local communities that have been disadvantaged, that then you would bring in as part of realizing that partnership. So I think maybe a way to think about redefining that value firms is also redefining the sort of the beneficiaries of the groups of stakeholders that are impacted. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's something that was a kind of revelation a bit for me here.
Yes, and another issue seems to be, besides measurement, disseminating the information and creating transparency around all parties' contributions to these efforts, right? Not just for-profit firms, but nonprofits as well as governments. I'm wondering if the UN has an approach to this, Mamadou Diane.
Speaking about the UN in general, I think will be quite difficult. But I think in the area I work in, it is not too different. Again, as I said, these are fundamentals in the way we work as an intergovernmental institution. But the UN Charter adopted a few decades ago started with "we the people," right? So it's about again, it's about that work between government and the various parts of the societies in which we work in. The ideas of peace, equality, and few others. These are the ingredients that are there. That's the short answer to that quite very, very important question.
Thank you. We are almost out of time. I want to thank the panel for taking questions from the audience and giving answers in depth. I want to thank the panel again for their flexibility and joining earlier than they thought we were meeting, and the audience for their patience and staying with us half an hour past the advertised time for this webinar. So if there are, I think what we've heard today is that there are very broad issues and a lot of different ways of looking at these, thinking about value creation in a fundamentally different way than we just teach in, say, in strategy courses, or just when we're thinking about the economic perspective for firms, to think broadly about the context, about the legal context, as well as the different levels of government and the different geographies in which problems play out, both cross-nationally within nations and at different levels, and to think about the many varied different governance forms that Ilse talked about. And there's clearly a lot of room for research on organizational design, as well as other aspects of value creation, dissemination, information sharing. And I hope we can continue this conversation as part of the Organizing for Good campaign, as well as later. And thank you very much again to the panelists and to the entire audience for being here with us today.